Welcome to the Daily Globe. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling upholding universal background checks for all firearms sales has sent shockwaves across the nation. This decision, expanding federal regulatory power, has ignited fierce protests from gun owners and Second Amendment advocates, while gun safety supporters hail it as a long-awaited victory. The ruling deepens America's divisions over guns, safety, and freedom, affecting millions of citizens and setting the stage for intense political and legal battles. It's a profoundly personal issue, pitting traditions of self-reliance against fears for public safety, and forces a national reckoning over what it means to be safe and free. As the country grapples with the fallout, the central question remains: how can a nation so divided find a path forward? The Second Amendment's 27 words have sparked centuries of debate, words that have been interpreted, reinterpreted, and fiercely contested since they were first written into the Bill of Rights in 1791. The language is simple, yet its meaning has proven anything but. For generations, Americans have asked, does the Second Amendment protect an individual's right to own firearms, or is it fundamentally tied to service in a well-regulated militia? This question has shaped legal arguments, political campaigns, and cultural identity. For much of the nation's history, courts and lawmakers linked the right to bear arms with the collective responsibility of militia duty, seeing it as a safeguard against tyranny and foreign threats. But in the late 20th century, a powerful movement emerged, reframing the Second Amendment as a guarantee of individual gun ownership. This shift was fueled by advocacy groups, political leaders, and a changing national conversation about personal liberty and self-defense. The debate reached a turning point in 2008, when the Supreme Court's landmark Heller decision affirmed that the Constitution protects an individual's right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. This ruling marked a dramatic reinterpretation of the Second Amendment's scope. Just 2 years later, McDonald v. City of Chicago extended this right, making it clear that state and local governments must also respect the individual right to keep and bear arms. The decision had sweeping implications for gun laws across the country. Yet, even as these cases expanded gun rights, the court acknowledged that the Second Amendment is not unlimited. Both decisions left open the possibility for reasonable regulation, such as restrictions on certain types of weapons or requirements for background checks. These landmark rulings didn't end the debate. Instead, they set the stage for a new era of legal and political battles, as lawmakers and citizens grappled with what kinds of regulations are permissible under the Constitution. In the years that followed, states passed a variety of measures, from assault weapon bans to expanded background checks, each sparking its own controversy and court challenges. Gun rights groups responded with lawsuits and lobbying, arguing that many of these laws infringe on constitutional freedoms. The result has been a patchwork of regulations that vary widely from state to state. It's in this contested and ever-evolving legal landscape that the question of universal background checks, one of the most debated gun control measures, finally reached the Supreme Court, setting the stage for another pivotal chapter in the story of the Second Amendment. The story of United States v. Miller, 2025, begins with the passage of the Enhanced Public Safety and Firearm Transfer Act of 2023, a sweeping piece of legislation that quickly became the center of national debate. The law was introduced in response to growing concerns about gun violence and the ease with which firearms could be transferred between private individuals without oversight. The act required that nearly all private gun sales, even those between friends or family members, be processed through federally licensed dealers. This meant that background checks became mandatory for almost every firearm transfer, closing what many called the private sale loophole. Supporters argued it was a necessary step to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous individuals, while critics saw it as an overreach into private transactions. Mark Miller, a lifelong gun collector from rural Montana, found himself at the heart of this controversy. When he tried to sell a rifle from his personal collection to a neighbor, he was told he had to go through a licensed dealer and submit to a federal background check process. Frustrated by what he saw as an unnecessary intrusion, Miller decided to challenge the law in court, arguing that it infringed on his rights as a law-abiding citizen. Miller's legal team argued that the new requirements placed an undue burden on the core rights protected by the Second Amendment, especially for responsible gun owners in rural areas. On the other side, the government maintained that the law was a reasonable and historically grounded regulation, designed to prevent firearms from falling into the wrong hands and to promote public safety. The central legal question became whether the federal government had the constitutional authority to regulate private, in-state gun sales to this extent, or if such oversight violated individual rights. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately sided with the government, upholding the law as a valid exercise of federal power. However, this decision conflicted with rulings from other federal courts, creating a split that demanded resolution by the Supreme Court. As the nation watched, the stage was set for a landmark Supreme Court decision, one that would define the boundaries of gun regulation and the meaning of the Second Amendment for years to come. The Supreme Court's majority upheld the universal background check law, ruling it doesn't infringe on the core right to keep and bear arms. The Chief Justice wrote that while the Second Amendment protects gun ownership, it doesn't guarantee acquisition without reasonable regulation. The opinion cited historical precedents for regulating dangerous goods, and argued that background checks are a modern extension of these principles. The court found the logistical burden minimal compared to the government's interest in preventing gun violence. It rejected claims of a national registry, noting legal safeguards against record retention. The majority concluded the law is a permissible regulation, not a substantive barrier to gun ownership. In dissent, Justice Thomas and two others condemned the ruling as a betrayal of the Second Amendment. They argued the law imposes unconstitutional burdens, turning a fundamental right into a privileged subject to bureaucratic control. The dissenters disputed the majority's historical analysis, calling the cited laws irrelevant to private, in-state sales. They warned the law paves the way for a national gun registry, eroding privacy and liberty. The dissent painted the law as a deliberate obstruction, especially for rural Americans. They concluded the decision is a grave threat to constitutional freedom. The ruling sparked immediate outrage among gun owners and advocacy groups, who saw it as a betrayal, especially by Justices Kavanaugh and Barrett. Organizations like the NRA and Gun Owners of America condemned the decision, vowing to fight it through legislation and the courts. Gun owners expressed fears of government overreach and a de facto registry, fueling calls for political action and civil disobedience. Social media erupted with defiance, and some states began exploring Second Amendment sanctuary laws to resist enforcement. The decision has mobilized a passionate community, setting up a prolonged conflict between federal authority and gun rights advocates. The debate is far from settled, it's only intensified. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a renowned constitutional law expert and professor, offers her perspective on the Supreme Court's recent decision. She explains that the ruling recalibrates, but does not overturn, the individual right to bear arms that was firmly established in the landmark Heller case. Instead, the court has chosen to refine the boundaries of that right, signaling a nuanced shift rather than a dramatic reversal. According to Dr. Vance, this decision reflects the court's ongoing effort to balance individual freedoms with the government's responsibility to ensure public safety. The court clarified that while Americans retain the right to own firearms, this right does not place them above reasonable regulation. In other words, the government can still impose certain restrictions, such as background checks and licensing requirements, as long as they are deemed reasonable and not arbitrary. This clarification is seen as a significant win for gun control advocates, who have long argued that sensible regulations are compatible with the Second Amendment. Dr. Vance points out that the court's reliance on the history and tradition test introduces a level of subjectivity into future legal debates. This test requires judges to interpret what kinds of gun regulations are consistent with the nation's historical practices, which can vary widely depending on interpretation. As a result, she predicts that legal battles over the scope and limits of gun laws are far from over, and that courts across the country will continue to grapple with these questions for years to come. She also acknowledges the dissent's concern about the potential for a national gun registry. While a centralized database remains prohibited by law, Dr. Vance notes that the infrastructure for tracking gun sales and ownership has become more robust in recent years. Enhanced background checks and digital record-keeping have made it easier for authorities to monitor transactions, even if a formal registry does not exist. This, she says, is a subtle but important shift, in how gun sales are tracked in the United States. According to Dr. Vance, the ruling's most profound impact may not be legal, but political. She believes it will energize both gun control supporters and gun rights advocates, fueling debates in state legislatures, Congress, and on the campaign trail. The decision is likely to influence upcoming elections, shape judicial nominations, and become a rallying point for activists on both sides of the issue. Gun safety advocates are now empowered to push for more action, seeing the ruling as validation for their efforts to promote responsible regulation. At the same time, gun rights supporters are galvanized, viewing the decision as a call to defend their constitutional freedoms more vigorously. Both sides are preparing for a prolonged struggle, knowing that the legal and political landscape remains unsettled. In the end, Dr. Vance concludes, the Supreme Court has resolved one legal question, but in doing so, it has intensified the broader political battle over gun rights and regulation in America, a debate that is sure to continue for years to come. The decision immediately affects millions. Private gun sales, even between neighbors, now require federal paperwork and background checks. This upends long-standing practices, especially in rural communities, and transforms informal exchanges into regulated transactions. Politically, Democrats and gun safety advocates see a court-sanctioned victory, while Republicans and gun rights supporters rally against perceived federal overreach. States with existing background check laws see little change, but others face new enforcement challenges and potential resistance. Second Amendment sanctuary movements are likely to surge, creating possible standoffs between local and federal authorities. The ruling may drive some sales underground and deepen distrust among gun owners, while others feel safer with stricter controls. Ultimately, the decision deepens America's cultural divide over guns. The Supreme Court's decision has amplified, not resolved, America's gun debate. The nation is more polarized, with each side mobilized by a new legal precedent. The future will bring legal challenges, political battles, and a struggle over the meaning of the Second Amendment. Citizens must stay informed and engaged. This is just the beginning of a new chapter. Leaders face a choice: deepen divisions for political gain or seek genuine dialogue and common ground. The fate of gun rights and regulation will be decided not just in courts, but at the ballot box and in public opinion. Navigating this landscape will require understanding, engagement, and a hope for peaceful coexistence.